The wooden lid rattles. It always rattled on those mornings. A stuttering, percussive sound against the cold ceramic rim of the donabe. A sound that meant the water had finally come alive after the long silence of the frozen night. You would hear it before you opened your eyes, before the light, before the ache in your fingers had softened enough to feel like hands again. That sound was the beginning of everything. There is a smell that exists only in the memory of those who have survived on very little. It is not the smell of food exactly. It is the smell of intention. The smell of a woman kneeling before a small fire at 4 a.m, pressing her palms flat against a clay pot, as if she were coaxing a heartbeat back into something cold and still. It is the smell of scorched rice water clinging to the inside of a cracked bowl, of dried kombu releasing its ancient ocean breath into a room where the windows are thick with frost, of daikon leaves, the parts the market would never want, wilting slowly into something the body could use. That smell is the entire history of Japanese survival, and we have nearly let it go. There is a word, mottainai, that does not translate cleanly into any modern language, because the feeling it describes has become, for most of us, unthinkable. It is the grief of waste, the shame of throwing away what still has something left to give. The grandmothers, the obachan who lived through the Showa winters, through rationing and drought and the particular dignity of having nothing. They did not need the word because they could not conceive of its opposite. The daikon top was not garbage. It was the beginning of supper. The water left from washing rice was not rinsed down a drain. It was a broth. The burnt crust at the bottom of the pot was not a failure. It was a delicacy scraped loose with a bamboo spatula and softened in hot water until it became something almost sweet, something almost enough. This is the record of 25 meals that have no place in any restaurant. They have no elegant presentation, no garnish, no story printed on a laminated card beside a price that would have fed a village. They are the meals of the Satoyama, the borderland between mountain and settlement, where people gathered what the land offered and refused to ask for more. They belong to the irori, the sunken hearth at the center of the old farmhouse floor. Shuti, where a single iron tetsubin hung from a bamboo hook and stayed warm from before dawn until long after the children had stopped shivering and fallen to sleep. That tetsubin, black and heavy and furred with years of mineral residue on its inner walls, was not a vessel. It was an altar. The water that came from it tasted of iron and time, and something you could not name but recognized immediately as safety. The first thing that went into the pot, almost every morning of every winter, was rice water. Not rice itself, not yet, but the water from the previous night's washing, cloudy and faintly sweet, full of loose starch that would thicken with heat and give the body the quiet reassurance of something substantial. Into this went whatever had dried on the rack above the hearth. A few strips of daikon cut in autumn and hung until they had shrunk to a fraction of their size and concentrated all their mineral sweetness into a leathery, golden curl. This was kiriboshi daikon soup, though no one called it that. It was just breakfast. It was the first of the 25, the foundation, the meal that said, "We are still here, and the land has not forgotten us." The kiriboshi would soften slowly, releasing a broth that tasted faintly of sugar and earth. If there was miso, a spoonful of the darkest, oldest miso from the bottom of the crock, where the dregs had thickened over months into something close to paste. It went in now. The chemistry of that addition is simple and ancient. The long-fermented miso carries within it a complexity of glutamates, the naturally occurring compounds that signal depth to the human tongue, compounds that required no meat, no dashi powder, no industrial amplification to perform their work. A tablespoon of old mugi miso in a pot of kiriboshi water created a broth that tasted, genuinely tasted, as though someone had labored over it for days. The grandmothers understood this without the vocabulary of chemistry. They understood it the way the body understands warmth, immediately and without argument. And then there was the silence between one pot and the next. The silence of the house waking. The silence of a child's bowl being filled a second time because the first had not been enough. Into that silence came the second meal, which was not always a separate meal, but a continuation, a deepening. Satsuma imo no shippu, the sweet potato porridge, came when the sweet potatoes left in the earthen storage pit beneath the floor began to soften at their edges and needed to be used before they gave themselves entirely to the dark. They were not peeled. There was no reason to peel them. The skins were scrubbed against a rough stone and cut into rough coins and dropped into the remaining soup broth with a cup of dried millet. The millet that was older than the rice crop, older than the silk trade, the grain that Japan grew on slopes too steep and too cold for anything more fragile. The millet would dissolve at its edges as it cooked, releasing a starch that made the whole pot creamy without a drop of anything that came from an animal. In our world of plastic and speed, we have forgotten the patience of the sweet potato skin, forgotten that the most nutritious part of a vegetable is almost always the part we are taught to throw away. The Oba-chan did not forget. She could not afford the luxury of forgetting. The records of the village tell us that the third and fourth meals of a hard winter were often indistinguishable from one another, separated only by what the cold ground or the dried rack had left to offer. Nozawana no ohitashi, the simplest act of blanching turnip greens in lightly salted water and pressing them into a small, dense brick to be sliced and floated in broth, appeared beside konnyaku no nimono, the slow simmering of konjac cakes in a thin stock of dried anchovy heads and soy, until the gray, gelatinous blocks had absorbed enough flavor to stop tasting of nothing and begin, just barely, to taste of something. Konjac is almost entirely water and fiber. It feeds the body almost nothing in caloric terms, and yet it gave the stomach the sensation of fullness, the critical psychological mercy of feeling fed that allowed a farmer to return to a frozen field and work until dark without the particular despair of true hunger gnawing through every thought. The dried anchovy heads, niboshi, deserve their own moment of reverence here, because they were the secret architecture of survival. A small bag of niboshi, costing almost nothing, could be boiled and reboiled across an entire week, each boiling drawing out a slightly thinner, slightly paler broth, until by the end of the week, the bones themselves had softened enough to eat. crushed between the back teeth and swallowed for their calcium. Wasted in absolutely no way. This was the fifth meal in the sequence of survival. Niboshi dashi no zosui, a rice porridge stretched with the final ghost of the anchovy stock, thickened with whatever starch remained in the pot, seasoned with a scraping of salt from the clay salt jar that sat beside the fire on a flat stone and never fully emptied, because the family had learned to treat it like water in a desert crossing. If you look into the bottom of the pot after a week of this cooking, you begin to understand what the word mottainai actually costs to practice. Every meal that followed was built on the residue of the meal before. The sixth was warabi no itame, the stir of bracken fern shoots gathered in early spring and preserved through the winter under salt and ash, rinsed patiently over 3 days to remove their bitterness, then dried quickly in the iron pan with a whisper of sesame oil that had been saved for precisely this kind of necessity. The fern shoots had a texture between meat and vegetable, a slight resistance under the tooth, a dark and slightly mineral flavor that made the body feel it had eaten something significant. It had. Bracken fern is dense with trace minerals that the winter body craves. The seventh was tofu no kasujiru, the soup made from sake leaves, the white paste-like sediment left after the sake had been pressed, which was rich in B vitamins and residual proteins, and had a warm, fermented, almost alcoholic sweetness that spread through the chest, like the first warm room after a long walk in the snow. Root vegetables went in, whatever was left. Gobo burdock root scraped clean with the back of a knife, a carrot if there was one, a wedge of winter squash from the ones strung by their stems from the ceiling rafters to keep them from the ground frost. The sake leaves dissolved into the broth and gave it a body, a richness, that had no business coming from something that was technically a byproduct of another process. But the grandmothers knew a different secret. The byproduct is often more alive than the product. The lees had more nutrition than the sake. The eighth and ninth meals arrived together in the imagination the way sisters arrive together, always in reference to one another. Kabocha no nimono, winter squash simmered in dashi and a thin glaze of soy and sugar. The sugar used not for sweetness, but for its ability to drive the flavor of the soy deeper into the dense orange flesh through the process of osmotic exchange. The same process that happens when you salt a vegetable and watch it weep its own moisture. The same chemistry that allows pickling to transform a raw radish into something with entirely different flavor architecture. And alongside it, or after it on the same fire, hijiki to gobo no nituke, the long simmer of dried sea vegetable and burdock root together, two ancient textures married in a dark, sweet soy bath until they became a single, concentrated tangle that you ate in very small amounts, because it was intensely flavored and because you knew it had to last 3 days. The 10th was yaki onigiri soup, not a soup you would make intentionally, but one that arrived out of necessity when the rice balls from the previous day had dried at their surfaces and hardened past the point of pleasant eating. You toasted them over the charcoal until the outside surface burned lightly, and then you dropped them into hot water with a pinch of salt. and the scorched rice dissolved into the water and flavored it with something almost smoky, almost nutty. And the interior of the rice ball softened and bloomed open in the pot. And you had a porridge that tasted as though it had been designed by someone with great skill and long deliberation. It had been designed by accident and poverty, and it was extraordinary. The tools of this spirit were not complex. The tetsuban for water, the donabe for slow, low heat, the suribachi, the ridged mortar, for grinding sesame seeds into a paste that could flavor an entire pot of greens with a single tablespoon. The bamboo zaru for draining and pressing. The wooden otoshibuta, the dropped lid that sits directly on the surface of simmering food to keep everything submerged without the violence of a full boil, to let the broth move slowly around each piece of burdock or dried tofu without breaking it apart. These were the instruments of an economy of motion, of a people who had understood long before any modern nutritionist put language to it that low and slow heat preserves the volatile compounds that fast, aggressive cooking destroys. The 11th meal was yomogi mochi jiru, a soup with small mochi cakes pounded with wild mugwort gathered from the hillside in early spring. The mochi made in quantity when the energy for pounding was available, and then dried into firm, shelf-stable pieces that lasted through winter and could be dropped into hot broth and softened back to something yielding. That mugwort had been used medicinally for longer than Japanese cooking had a written record. Its bitterness was the bitterness of medicine, and the body recognized it as something functional, something the liver and the blood needed, without anyone explaining why. The 12th was kiri kombu no miso shiru, a miso soup made with shredded dried kelp. The kelp cut into thin ribbons before drying and reconstituted in the pot with almost nothing else. Because the kelp itself, when given enough time in hot water, released enough glutamic acid to make a broth that needed no assistance. The 13th was tofu no shirataki nabe, the simplest of nabe preparations. A clay pot, a low fire, blocks of silken tofu and ribbons of konjac noodles in a very thin broth made from the last of the niboshi, seasoned with white miso and eaten slowly, very slowly. Because the meal was small, and the act of eating slowly is itself a form of making more. The records of the village tell us that the 14th was considered a special meal, not because it was elaborate, but because it required a particular abundance of patience. Nuka-zuke, no soup. The vegetables from the rice bran pickling crock, cucumbers or daikon or eggplant that had been buried in the living ferment of nuka for weeks, were removed, rinsed briefly so they were not aggressively salty, and simmered in water with a single piece of dried kombu. The lactic acid fermentation they had undergone gave the broth a faint sourness, a whisper of tang that made the palate wake up, that cut through the monotony of a winter diet, and reminded the tongue that food could surprise you even when the pantry was nearly empty. The 15th was soba no tsuru, buckwheat cooking water. Not soba itself, which was precious, but the water left in the pot after the noodles had been boiled. Cloudy and gray-green with the water-soluble rutin that buckwheat contains in extraordinary quantities. The flavonoid that supports circulation in cold extremities, that keeps the small blood vessels of the hands and feet open and functional in the deep cold. You drank it from a cup, this sobayu warm, and slightly starchy, and it was both meal and medicine and the most honest example of mottainai that any tradition has ever produced. The 16th was kasuzuke no nimono, the slow simmering of vegetables that had been preserved in sake lees, fish if the family lived near a coast or river, yellowtail or cod, or even the skeleton of a fish sold cheap because no one else would buy it. The collar and the head and the belly flap, where the fat lived, simmered until every piece of connective tissue had dissolved into the broth, and every bone had given up its marrow. This was the meal that required no seasoning, because the saklis and the fish themselves had already done everything the tongue could ask for. The 17th and 18th arrived in the middle of the coldest weeks, when the pantry had contracted to its inner chamber. Kabu no ha no ohitashi, turnip leaves blanched and dressed with a thin soy, was followed on the same evening, in the same pot after the leaves had been removed, by a simple shimizu ni, clear simmered broth of the turnip bulbs themselves, thin slices barely cooked, floating in water that tasted of almost nothing but the vegetable's own sweetness, which in deep winter becomes concentrated and almost floral. But the grandmothers knew a different secret about the 19th meal, which was natto jiru, fermented soybeans, pungent and stringy and polarizing even within the culture that created them, were pressed through the suribachi until they became a thick paste and then dissolved into hot dashi, creating a soup of extraordinary protein density and probiotic complexity. It smelled, to the unaccustomed nose, aggressive and alive. To the body that had been surviving on starch and brine for weeks, it was a profound correction. The 20th was taro imo no neri, a simple paste made from boiled mountain taro pounded with salt and a little miso, eaten with the fingers from a small wooden dish. Served to children first, because the taro was filling and calmed the stomach, and to the elderly, last for the same reason. The 21st was the meal of the very bottom of winter, hoshi shiitake no dashi meshi, rice cooked not in water, but in the soaking liquid of dried shiitake mushrooms, which carries within it a concentration of lentinin and aritadenine and the nucleotide compounds that create the fifth taste, the taste that says depth and satisfaction and enough. Rice cooked until each grain had absorbed the dark gold of the mushroom water and tasted, unmistakably, of something the forest had been saving for this exact moment. The 22nd was hacho miso no okayu, a rice porridge made with the darkest, most aged miso available. The miso that had fermented for 3 years in cedar barrels weighted with river stones. The miso whose surface had developed a crust of complex yeasts that the maker scraped away and set aside to start the next barrel. This porridge was eaten by the ill, by the very young, by anyone whose body had reached its limit, because the aged miso was understood, correctly, to be full of enzymes and bacterial cultures that could restore a disrupted gut and return the body to its capacity to absorb whatever small nutrition was available. The 23rd was the pickled plum soup, umeboshi no okayu, 1 plum broken into a pot of plain rice porridge, its salt and acidity spreading through the starch like a slow tide, preserving the porridge against spoilage for the hours it might sit on the warm edge of the fire, providing the organic acids that aided the body's metabolism of carbohydrates. The antimicrobial compounds that the grandmothers understood not as chemistry, but as the particular way this food kept the family from getting sick during the most dangerous weeks. The 24th was Nameko to Nato no Miso Shiru, the small, slippery forest mushroom combined with fermented soybean in a dark miso broth. A combination that required almost no preparation because both ingredients required almost no preparation. A combination that existed at the outermost edge of the pantry when everything else had been used and the spring was still too far away to count on. It was not beautiful. It was not a meal you would describe with pleasure to a stranger. It was the meal that meant you had made it, that the winter was nearly finished, that you had wasted nothing, sacrificed nothing you could not bear to sacrifice, and the pot had held you. The 25th was Okoge Okayu, the burnt rice porridge, the one that begins this record and ends it. The charred crust scraped from the bottom of the donabe on the last night of the season, softened in the last cup of warm water from the tetsubin, eaten in the half-dark by someone who has been keeping a fire alive since before dawn, who has made 24 meals from what the modern eye would see as nothing, and who is now, in this final bowl, eating the residue of all of them. The generation that ate these meals lived, on average, into their 90s. They did not count their macronutrients. They did not track their inflammation markers or optimize their gut microbiome with supplements sold in amber bottles. They ate fermented foods every day because fermented foods kept. They ate fiber in quantities we would now consider extraordinary because fiber grew from the ground around them and required no purchase. They ate slowly around a fire without distraction, in silence that was not empty but full of the sounds of the house and the season and each other. In our world of plastic and speed, we have built an entire industry around rediscovering what they never abandoned. We call it ancestral health. We call it the longevity diet. We publish books about fermentation and root vegetables and the wisdom of eating what is local and seasonal and whole. And we sell these books for the price of a week's groceries in a Showa farmhouse. And we feel that we are learning something new. We are not learning something new. We are remembering something old. We are hearing, if we are very quiet, still the sound of a wooden lid rattling over a charcoal fire in a frozen room, and the soft exhale of a woman kneeling beside it, pressing her palms to the clay, calling the water back to life. She is not in the room. She has not been in the room for a very long time. But her hands are still here, in the temperature of the pot, in the patience required to wait for the broth to deepen, in the decision, made without drama or ceremony, to waste absolutely nothing. Honor the shadows. They kept the fire.